Hi, I'm Len Epp from Leanpub, and in this episode of the Leanpub podcast, I'll be interviewing Matt Hawthorne. Based in Philadelphia, Matt is an independent software engineer, consultant, and advisor whose focus areas are distributed systems, AI and machine learning infrastructure, and pushing things into production. He has previously worked at big name companies, including Twitter, Netflix, Comcast, and others. You can find him on Twitter at mhawthorne and check out his website at supremeinformatics.com, as well as his Push to Prod Substack at pushtoprod.substack.com. Matt is the author of the book Push to Prod or Die Trying: High-Scale Systems, Production Incidents, and Big Tech Chaos. In the book, Matt discusses some of the toughest software engineering challenges through the lens of Neurofilm, a fictional San Francisco Bay Area tech company inspired by his real-world experiences at Netflix, Twitter, and other companies. By the end of the book, you'll have laughed, you'll have cried, and you'll have acquired a lengthy list of lessons and techniques to apply in your daily work. In this interview, we're going to talk about Matt's background and career, his professional interests, his book, and at the end, we'll talk a little bit about his experience writing a book. So thank you very much, Matt, for being on the Leanpub podcast.
Yeah, thanks for having me. It's good to be here.
I always like to start these interviews by asking people for their origin story. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about where you grew up and, how you found your way into a career in tech and working at, all these companies we've all heard about.
Yeah, so I was born in Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. Shout out Harrisburg. So it's the east coast of the US. In terms of origin story, I remember doing some programming in the basic language when I was pretty young, maybe like 7 or 8. We had a computer class. I can remember writing go-to statements. At least I think basic has go-tos, and kind of understanding it, but not really. And then didn't really program again seriously until I got to college. So there weren't a lot of computer classes, at least the ones that I took, and we didn't have a computer at home growing up for whatever reason. So yeah, when I got to college, is when I started, like, for my coursework, started writing C and C++ and a little bit of Java towards the end.
And why did you, I'm just looking at your LinkedIn here. You were at the University of Pittsburgh and you just studied computer engineering. Why did you decide to study that subject?
So I'd always done well to my memory in math and science. And so the like conventional wisdom from teachers was you should be an engineering major. And so then it was what type of engineering? There's civil or electrical, or and then I saw computer, and I'd always liked video games. And so I said, yeah, computer sounds good. So just decided to do that. And here we are 30 years later. It seems like it was at minimum a decent choice, but at the time it was pretty random.
One of the questions related to that comes up on this podcast relatively frequently is, I think you and I are of a relatively similar vintage. Um, but if you were starting out, so from that perspective, if you were starting out now, like let's say you're 18, you just graduated high school, and you were going into university with an intention of having a career in tech, would you study kind of computer science or software engineering at university?
Yeah, I mean, I don't think I would do computer engineering specifically because I was half hardware and half software, but that's a little bit of like an edge case. I think that's a tough one, right? I mean, fundamentally, I think the question is how do you get a job? And to get a job, you have to be able to pass the interview. And I don't think you learn a lot of things, at least when I went to college, they didn't teach a lot of things that would have helped me pass a lead code interview or even a behavioral interview. But a behavioral interview is more so just vibes. And so I think you would do just as well, if not better, just doing independent study, or even if you could get like an apprenticeship somewhere in terms of how to get a job in the tech industry. I think the problem is getting through the filters up front, like the recruiter filters, where I think going to a university where you were a CS major at Stanford or even like University of Pittsburgh or Virginia Tech or something, I think that does help you pass through the filter. So I think you got to decide, like, you either need to know somebody, like have a connection at a company, or have built something online that other people have seen. If you're not gonna go to school, you need something else that can substitute for that, but I don't know that that's gonna be enough to get through a recruiter. You would need to really, I think, know someone to shortcut that process. So I think that's sort of details around the hiring process. In terms of the raw knowledge, I mean, my school, again, this was a while ago, but it taught the fundamentals. It didn't really teach skills that were relevant in any job that I've had. So I'd have a hard time telling someone you should spend 4 years in school and spend a lot of money, when I don't know that it helps you that much to get a job and also to perform on the job.
One thing we talked about briefly before we started recording was that you used to work for a defense company, and one thing I've heard from people I've interviewed in the past too, but I've asked that specific question to, is that actually there are lots of kind of like big companies that just have like basically regulations that we can only hire people who've got computer science degrees and stuff like that. Is that generally true?
That's a good question. I mean, I think there are criteria of every, like, company and industry. Like, there are some companies, I believe, that will only hire people from certain, like, well-esteemed universities. I think with defense contracting is one of those niches where, um, I think you have to be a citizen generally, and there's the security clearance stuff, and so that's, being able to pass a security clearance is kind of like a whole other conversation. But I think, yeah, maybe to your point, there are some corners where you would be able to find a job, like, without a college degree easier than others.
It's really interesting to me. One thing I noticed, looking at your LinkedIn and your experience at these big name companies, I worked for a big investment bank at one point in my life, and I know what it's. I know I can tell from the way you're talking you've been through these processes where there's multiple tiers of interviews and multiple types of interviews, and like getting through them requires not just being smart and accomplished and having lots of things to say, but like thinking about the interview process. And I think you've mentioned behavioral interviews, and you talk about this in your book. So for anyone interested or scared or concerned, what do I have to figure out if I'm like applying for like some like big name company where it's very serious, very kind of like regimented? Uh, what's a behavioral interview?
Yeah, I would say, like, before we talk about behavioral, like, we should clarify, like, a technical interview is writing code
Right.
or, like, system design or something like that. But then there's a behavioral, which is something like they ask you questions to learn more about your, like, personality characteristics or, like, your past performance on projects or things like that. They're trying to learn about you in that sense, not just, "Can you solve this technical problem?" And so an example behavioral question is something like, "Tell me about a time you had a disagreement with a colleague." I think,
Mhm.
maybe another example that's a little more technical is like, "Tell me about a project that you led and how it went." That's a little more open-ended, but that's, kind of, an example of a behavioral one too. So I think it's, you need to have good stories, like, to kinda shortcut to, like, how do you answer them? You need to have an arsenal of stories that you can choose from to answer these questions, because you also don't know. One of the tricky things about behavioral interviews is it's not like you're given the list of questions up front. So sometimes they ask you a question, you answer it, then they ask you another question, and you should have used a story from the first, answer, but you already used that one. So you enter this space where they're not gonna give you the questions up front, so you have to be prepared to, like, adjust on the fly. You wanna prepare, but you can only prepare so much because things really do change on the ground.
That's really interesting that you mentioned stories. That's just so true, for again, for sort of like high level kind of jobs. And it's partly people are like, they want you to have meaningful experiences that you can just talk about naturally. And you prepare, and as you say, you prepare for like, I'll use this story for this, use this story for that, maybe, but you have to shift on the fly. Um, but yeah, that's just so crucial for anyone interested in sort of like mastering the interview. Have stories to tell about yourself. There's nothing. I mean, having been like on the recruiting side of things myself a little bit, and as I know you have and you write about in the book as well, and sometimes too much maybe, but like a person who can't tell a story tells you a lot about themselves, and the way they think. It's very striking, the difference between someone who can and who can't. Um, my own experience sort of with kind of behavioral interviews is, I remember one time, I was going to interview somebody and with a colleague, and after we were done, my colleague said, "We shouldn't do it to him." Um, that it would just kind of ruin the person's personality to give them a kind of 120-hour a week job.
I see. I mean, I was that's very humane of your colleague. I mean, look, you never know what someone's gonna notice in an interview. I can remember my dad having a story about an interview that happened at a restaurant, and they brought the food, and my dad always would taste his food before he would season it, and so he said the food came, everyone else put, like, salt and pepper on their food, he waited, and he claims that's why he got that job, and, that's certainly I never would have guessed that that's what was being evaluated. Again, some interviews do involve, like, a lunch with a few people, and, you never know what they are watching.
Oh, yeah, that actually that's funny, that reminds me, and, one, I know someone who I know a few. I went to Oxford, so I know a few Rhodes Scholars, and I know one guy. So the way the Rhodes Scholars interviews used to work, at least, was, there's regions, and all the applicants who make it to the kind of final stage are called to a place, like a hotel or something like that, and, uh, this was around the time of 9/11, and this candidate made sure to be like in the TV room at the hotel when the first kind of attack started in Afghanistan.
I see.
Some of the people sort of doing the selecting showed up because they were very serious customers. Um, this was an American candidate. They were very serious customers, and they noticed him there at like 3 in the morning, deliberately, there to watch that kind of thing. And like
Interesting.
this kind of thing can actually play a huge role at a certain kind of level, being aware of that kind of stuff.
Yeah, it's tricky because you don't necessarily wanna do something that isn't, like, straightforward and honest. You wouldn't wanna do something like that if it wasn't sincere, and so the way I try to look at it, or if I advise someone else, is just try to be your best self. Try to show the habits that are the best side of you, or tell the story that's the best representation of you. That's all you can really hope for in an interview.
Oh yeah, that no, that's I love that. That you can't fake it. That's the other thing
You
about
could try,
it.
but
You can
it's
try, but people will. 99% of the time, they'll see through you.
right, and then you were up at 3 in the morning watching TV for no reason.
Yeah. Yeah, exactly, exactly. So actually that leads me to ask, one of the questions I wanted to ask you is, so a lot of people, they've sort of worked for when the programmers, they work for startups and stuff like that, but you've worked for some big name companies like Twitter and stuff like that. What's it like, day one at a big name company like that?
Yeah, so I think even the big name companies, the ones I've worked for, they're all different. And so like Twitter, for example, I feel like the first few weeks was orientation. There was all these classes and training and learning lots of interesting things about Twitter. And I was doing, a little bit of like team and project work, but it was mostly orientation. Whereas there's other big companies where you start contributing much faster than that. And like Netflix, I don't know if we would consider Netflix a big company at the time when I was there, but I think I started doing real work pretty quickly. There wasn't any formal training at that time. Netflix was probably closer to a startup in terms of the vibe than a big company. But I think, kind of to reiterate, I think every company is different. But generally speaking, I think most big companies have some type of training you're going to do, or like orientation for the first week or two.
And yeah, and one thing so let's moving on to talk about your book a little bit, because it's so interesting. One of the things you talk about and is boldness at companies, and how, like, big companies can kind of get too secure, and they can also get sort of like, small companies can be too afraid of failing and things like that. So what's the concept of boldness that you write about in the book?
Yeah, so I couldn't remember. So again, we're going back, and again, the book it's about a fictional company called Neurofilm, but it's inspired by real experiences. So there was a time back in like 2011, I think, where Netflix did the Quickster thing, which was trying to split the company into, there was going to be a DVD half and a streaming half. And then if you wanted both, your price was going to double or go up by 40% or something. And the stock price tanked. It was very bad for the company at that time. But I can remember, like, internally, it didn't really seem that bad. Like, people were saying, "Yeah, it sucks the stock price went down," but it wasn't like total doom and gloom. It was as much entertaining as anything else. Now, again, I was so new, I didn't, like, really care about my stock options or things like that. I was more focused on, like, trying to do my work and adjust to living in the Bay Area because I had just moved there. So maybe other people were more bummed about it than I was. But what was interesting was, I think this is in the book. There was an all hands, and Reed Hastings, who was the CEO at the time, got up on stage and he had this risk axis. And it was, to my memory, like timid, cautious, bold, reckless. It was in that sequence. And he said, like, where do you think we are? And he said, I think most people would say we're bold. Some people would say we're closer to reckless. And maybe some people would say we're timid, which seems a little crazy, but some people maybe think we're not bold enough. But his point was, um, we're not going to succeed. We have to be bold to succeed. And so sometimes we're going to make mistakes, we're going to make missteps, but we have to be bold. And I think that was like, that captured the energy of Netflix at that time. I mean, again, Netflix was not then what it is now. It was a smaller company. We were just in two countries at that time. I think it was
Oh,
just US and Canada. We went to Latin America in like Labor Day of 2011, I believe. So that was right after I started. But like Amazon was doing video, and Amazon had a lot more money than Netflix did. You had bigger companies like Comcast. You had even Apple was getting in the video. Apple has a lot more money than Netflix does, or at least did at the time. So it was very much succeed or die, or we have to be bold and succeed, or we're just not gonna be around. And I felt like that was different than any place that I had worked, and that was a very interesting way to look at it, and there was, like, a clear justification for that boldness that might be harder to find at other companies.
That's very interesting. You're reminding me of, I think there was a famous Reed Hastings, like, slide deck of, like, that was, like, 200 slides long or something like that about, like, what's it like to work, what's it gonna be like to work for Netflix?
That's the culture deck. Yeah, I
The
think
culture deck, yeah.
they that was around even when I got recruited. I think they redid it at some point, maybe, like, 2020, but, yeah, I think that's still on the website. It
Yeah, I
used to
remember
not be that long. It used to be more like 20 slides, I think.
Make I just remember one thing that really struck me about that when I first read that was, you have to be willing to take out the garbage. I think that might have
Yeah.
been one of them, and, like,
Yeah,
if
yeah.
you know what that means, you know what that means, right? It's like, you're here to do something. You're not here for hierarchy, you're not here for status, you're not here for, like, sharp elbows, office jockeying. You're here to achieve a goal.
Yeah, absolutely. I think the funny thing about, like, Reed Hastings, for example, you would just see him in the kitchen, like, getting a banana or getting some blueberries. Like, he was very much it felt like he was among the people at my time there. I had never worked at a company where I saw the CEO just walking down a hallway. It would, like, nod at you and acknowledge your presence. But, yeah, I think that taking out the garbage is really interesting. I think, like, a different way to frame that is a culture of ownership. It's like if you see some trash on the floor, pick it up and throw it away. And I think that's a really hard thing to cultivate, and so I think that is something that Netflix was very good at least compared to other places I've worked, that I think a lot of companies wish they had that, like, again, people being what are some other kind of, like, examples? People proactively finding and fixing problems as opposed to, like, waiting to be told what to do, and I think, like, most companies would say, "Yes, we want that," but it's the question is, are you willing to really think about it and do the work to build that type of culture? And I think Netflix, at least at that time, definitely was.
This is a bit of a kinda out there question, but you do mention it that one of the striking things about, that, Reed Hastings was looking you in the eye. And, famously, like, there are CEOs who say, like, that before they come to visit a site, they'll actually, like, have people who go before them and say, like, "Don't look him in the eye," or "Don't look her in the eye," and stuff like that. What is
Yeah.
what is it? I mean, I actually knew someone who worked for a giant insurance company once, and when the CEO came, he had an order that the air conditioning had to be turned to the max to make it as cold as possible in the office so people were uncomfortable whenever he came.
Right.
It I mean, I don't know, just what's your opinion about that? I mean, you mentioned him looking you in the eye and how striking that was, at Netflix. What is it about that kinda culture that, you know, that sort of actually people can be elevated to kind of CEO levels with that kind of, like, I don't know, exclusionary or hierarchical attitude?
Yeah, it was distinct. I mean, I didn't remember that I wrote that, but I can remember I'd walk by him in the hallway, like, multiple times. He probably doesn't remember it, but and he would look you in the eye and nod, and I just kn this guy's, a multi-billionaire. He's a CEO of a company. That's not an experience I had, and I think that kinda speaks to like, Netflix was a flatter company than most other companies. Like, again, I worked at Comcast. I loved working at Comcast, so my intent here is not to pick on them, but it was a much more, like, hierarchical company, and so if I had an issue, I might have to elevate it to my manager, who has to elevate it to a director, who has to elevate it to a senior director. I can't go and talk to a senior director on some other team directly. I have to ask my senior director to talk to that senior director, and that's, I mean, we're all human beings, right? We can talk to each other. And on one hand, I can get how some VP might not want to talk to some random engineer on another team. You might not be communicating at the same altitude in terms of technical detail, but I do think there is something to, like, anyone can talk to anyone. When I was at Netflix, like, random VPs would come into my cube and ask me questions. I didn't always want them in my cube asking me questions. Sometimes they're asking you to do something and you're like, "Can I say no to this?" But it's overall, despite there being a few negatives, I think it's a good thing for there to be that open type of communication across a company and for it not to be so hierarchical. Because there's a lot of loss. Again, the message I want to deliver when it has to go up 5 levels and then across and then back down, is that the same message? Or is there some transformations happening in between that make us and again, that's much less of an efficient way to operate, and I think it just makes you feel worse than being able just to talk directly.
Yeah, I can totally identify with that. The idea of hierarchy. I mean, there's institutions like the military where you kind of like understand why there's sort of enforced hierarchy, but there are other kind of places in life where you can find that the hierarchy is just kind of arbitrary, And if you're a smart kind of driven person, that just becomes a kind of obstacle to, yeah, as you were saying, like clear communication and stuff like that. And you're just sitting there like, you know, why am I subject to this kind of nonsense?
I think there's,
So
I mean, one thing about hierarchy, I think there's like two dimensions there. There's like communication hierarchy, which is what I was talking about. But I think there's also kind of directional hierarchy, like more of the command and control of military. And I do think those are two distinct things. Like I think at Netflix, the communication hierarchy was pretty open, but I still had a manager. And sometimes my manager would ask me to do something or tell me to do it. And I understood that like I should do that thing because that was my manager. And I think what's interesting is some of the other companies where the communication hierarchy is more strict, the command hierarchy is less strict. So it's
mm,
for whatever reason. I think
mm,
when things are more open, it sometimes makes it more comfortable for people to give and take direction because I think there is more of a mutual respect. Again, maybe that's just my um, theory or perspective on it.
yeah, no, that's a very interesting perspective, and obviously, hard won through lots of experience, like your book obviously is. And actually, so one striking part of your book is lesson 1.3 that I really liked. When overwhelmed, make a list of questions.
Yep.
And you write about being asked to solve a critical problem in an area that you had zero experience with,
Right.
which is a cool, like, I mean, looking back on it, kind of cool thing. But when it sort of, the wave hits you, that can be difficult. So I was wondering if you could talk a little bit about that experience.
Yeah, so that was inspired by a real experience I had at Netflix. So Netflix was launching in Europe. This was towards the end of 2011. I joined Netflix in May 2011. I think my manager and I talked about this in August 2011. Like, we're going to launch in Europe. How do we get our traffic into Europe, our traffic and our data into Europe? Can you look into that and figure it out? And I said,
Wow.
sure. But so we're launching in Europe January 2012. We probably have to have things up and running by like November 15th because once the holidays hit, things get a little crazy. So I got maybe 3 months to figure this out. And it was pretty overwhelming. I didn't even know what I didn't know. And I felt like, so it's a few things. The one is I'm overwhelmed and I'm thinking, maybe isn't there someone else on the team that's better suited for this than me? But then I looked around and realized like, yeah, maybe a little bit, but for the most part, we're all doing stuff we haven't done before. Like we're a growing company. And so I I might as well give this a shot. And so I struggled with like, I don't know how to approach this. And what I did was, okay, just write down a bunch of questions that you have that you wish you had the answer to. That's like a good starting point. I think the time pressure really forced me to act. Like, I don't know what I'm doing, but I got to make some progress today. Let me just write something down. What should I write down? Write down some questions. And so then I look at these questions, I start finding answers to them. Like, okay, how does traffic get routed today? What's via DNS? How is that configured? How could we get it into Europe? It's like directional DNS. How does that work? I learned about that. Does that work 100% of the time? No. Why not? How do we handle that? Can a customer go to the wrong region? No, it just doesn't work with the way some data was cached. And so then iterating through these like 10, 15 questions, now I have a space where I have the shape of different solutions coming more clear. And from there, okay, we got these two options on how to approach it. I think, okay, I like this option better. We're going to send redirects to devices as opposed to proxy on the server, which I won't get into here. And now I have something I can propose to go out and get buy-in. I didn't know, like, can the client teams, can the, PS4 and Xbox team make this change within 3 months? It turned out, yes, they can. We can roll out a client-facing change for every device in 3 months because that's the speed that Netflix operated at. And then at the end, we had a solution that ended up launching and being successful. And so I think through that, like the pure overwhelming fear that I experienced at that time, I came out of that with a process that, maybe that process sounds obvious to some people. If so, like I envy you. It wasn't obvious to me, but through that I learned a mechanism for when you feel totally clueless, at least you can like write down your questions and then you'll be at the end of the day, you're maybe a little bit less clueless, which is a good place to be.
Yeah, no, I just really love that answer to that kind of situation. There's one thing is sort of panicking. There's kind of like going around asking other people questions, but there's just like, in a sense, kind of doubling yourself. Here's me in this situation. Here's what someone else would ask if they needed these answers from me,
Right.
and write them down and then try and address them. Is very kind of like, I think, very realistic way of approaching those difficult problems. And I love the way you put it too, that, sometimes we all come to kind of these answers in our own way. And what can seem obvious to one person is not, is a struggle for another. And that reminds me actually of there's a section in your book where you talk about we're all imposters.
Right.
Um, and I think that that's true. Like that's anyone who's been kind of in a situation where they all of a sudden have a huge responsibility that they haven't been directly prepared for has that feeling. Then why me? Um, I just for anyone sort of out there, sort of who might be experiencing kind of imposter syndrome, what would your advice be to someone who's like, suddenly they're like kind of like, oh my God, I've been asked to do something that I don't feel prepared to do.
Yeah, and I think a little bit of what I said in the last answer was actually stuff from this lesson, but either way, I think, like imposter syndrome, I suspect that term gets overused a bit. It's a special case of insecurity. You're insecure. You feel like I'm not as qualified to do this thing as the people around me are, or at least that's my perception of it. And so I think it's a few things. I think for one, you're probably more there's a good chance you're more qualified to do it than you think you are. I think we tend to underestimate our own competence and overestimate the competence of those around us. Like, how do you know that other people are so confident and comfortable doing what they are and you're not? Um, but I also think like there was something else there about the feeling you get when the people around you believe in you. So it's like I was working on this thing.
Mm.
I didn't feel qualified. I didn't feel prepared. I was concerned that I wasn't going to be able to solve it properly. But my manager thought I could do it. Now, maybe he just didn't have anyone else to give the work to, but it doesn't matter. He gave it to me. And I felt like I had a management chain that believed that I could do it. I had a company that believed in me. They brought in some dude that had only been there for 2 months or 3 months and said, hey, figure out how to get traffic into Europe. Again, that was just traffic for our team, but we were the edge. So if our traffic didn't make it to Europe, nobody could stream. So I think that there was a feeling of like, maybe I'm not confident, but the people around me had confidence in me. And through that, I absorb some of that confidence. Sometimes you just have to, like just operate within the environment that you're in and it's say like, well, let me just give it my best shot. They think I can do it. And I think that's to a certain extent what everyone is doing. We just don't see it on the outside. We don't get to see the stuff they're dealing with internally.
Not all colleagues or managers are positive though, and you write about this a little bit in your book where you talk about avoiding people who dump work on you. Which that sounds
Yeah.
I mentioned before, hard-won knowledge. There's a lot of it in this book.
Yeah.
But how can you tell someone who's as opposed to someone who's just sort of granting you responsibility for a sort of important job? What's the difference between that and somebody who's dumping work on you?
Yeah. So to be clear, like this is not your manager asking you to do something because like
Mm.
that's what managers often do. They ask you to take on something.
Right.
This is so to get a little more specific, this was a guy that was my teammate, very nice guy, but he came into my cube and said, "Hey, can you fix this problem? We're having an issue with some proxy somewhere." And I said, "Sure, okay." And, not realizing at the time, I've now committed myself to solve this very nasty problem on a Thursday afternoon that I thought I might be working on this all weekend because it was some like deadline involving like a Apple TV or something. And so I think, my lesson here was you're probably gonna get burned at least once because this works differently. This happens at every company and it happens in different ways with different people. You are sometimes gonna end up doing something that someone just kind of dumped on you. They could do it themselves. There's no reason they can't do it, but they came in and asked you to do it instead. And now you said yes, and now you're stuck with it. Um, but learn what that looks like and learn the pattern. Learn like the language you have to use to say to someone, sorry, I can't take that on right now. And ideally, you do it in a way that they won't bother you again. That they know, like, okay, I can't do this to this person. Let me try it with someone else. And so I want to be clear, like this sounds very cynical. And I don't think everyone that does this is operating from like a purely cynical place. Like sometimes I might have stumbled upon a problem and I have something else that I have a deadline for, and I'm just going to ask whoever's on call to take this for me. Like, you could probably, like, that person might think I'm dumping work on them. For me, it's like we all have to prioritize. But I think this is a thing that happens everywhere. It happens across teams too. You have teams that have a certain responsibility and they're like, we don't want to maintain this thing anymore. How do we convince this other team to take this thing? This happens everywhere. And I think it's really, you can just say no. You can say, like, no, we're not going to do that. But I think if you can learn to say no in a way that's a little bit smoother and a little bit maybe slippery, it can just feel better for everyone. It's kind of like a negotiation. You want everyone to leave feeling good about themselves. And so that's what I talk about here. And I also talk about, like, with that specific problem, I had a teammate that, as I was in this device lab just suffering, walked by and saw me there and said, "Hey, can I help?" And he helped me through it. So that was the other side of the story, is like I had this person that dumped this work on me, but then I had this angel that came in and saved me from this problem. So, like, I think that's what saved that part from being too cynical, that I had, I got to see both sides of the spectrum there. And I think, we all work with people who wear both of those hats at different times.
Yeah, no, that's a really great way of describing it. I mean, it's like sometimes, the framing of someone dumping work on you is someone who like kind of like, just kind of is lazy or doesn't want to do it, but it can also be someone who doesn't have the confidence themselves to do it. Um, uh,
That's true.
you
Yeah,
know,
that's
and
true.
but the way I love the way you're framing these things, that there's two sides to sort of like these interactions that happen. And sometimes like the kind of dumping is like, maybe they really just do have too much to do.
Yeah.
Maybe the constraints on them are just too high. Or yeah, maybe they're not confident enough or something like that. But there can be all kinds of reasons why people do things like that. Um, one thing you also write about is defending your time as if your life depends on it. I'm looking at your book here. This is lesson 3.3.
Right.
And I was just wondering if you could talk a little bit about time management. And you talk about the infinite stream of sorrow there, which is very evocative.
Yeah, you're saying I've forgotten I've written some of these things. So yeah, well, the words sound funny when I hear them repeated back to me. Um, yeah, so at that time I worked on the Edge teams. If you think about Netflix, um, again, this is inspired by my time working on the Edge team at Netflix. There was all the devices in the wild, like, PS4s, I think it was at the time, and Xboxes and, TVs and all that. And then on the other side, you have all the back-end services, like the search and personalization services, authentication. And so we sat in between. We're like taking the device traffic and like routing it to back-end services and kind of providing a functional layer. And so because of that, where we were in the stack, we just had so many operational issues because, Netflix has incidents where like streaming is down or these customers are getting an error, and people would come to us saying, "Can you tell us what the error is?" And we would say, like, "How do we know?" Like, we sit in between, but sometimes we don't have information on the specific thing you're asking, but they didn't have it either. So there was kind of this soft burden that was placed on us to, like, we have to move these things forward, even if it doesn't feel fair. And kind of the larger point is that when you're operating at that scale, or one of the larger points, there's 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 stuff happening everywhere. There's errors happening everywhere. They're not all severe errors. You might be getting like a cache miss somewhere, but it's like a unexpected cache miss or something, and it's not that person can still stream. It's just going to be a little bit slower. And so we had to learn, like, if you spend all of your time responding to questions from other teams, if you spend all of your time looking at every blip and every graph and trying to explain it like perfectly, that's all you're going to do. That's going to be 100% of your time. And that is a job. You could spend 100% of your time doing that, but is that the job that you want? And is that, if you're like a manager or director of a team, is that what you want your team to be doing? And so I think, like, that was sort of the point with the defend your time, is like kind of similar to the last thing we talked about. We had to learn this language of, I spent an hour looking at that. It was a blip for 2 minutes. Everything's fine now. There's a bunch of other stuff going on. We can't look at this anymore. Like, learning that language to tell other teams, we've invested the like requisite time. We have to stop looking into this. Or kind of, there's a, I guess, a larger thing I talk about later in that chapter is, um, you have to build tools so that other people can answer their own questions. And so that's a part of defending your time too. You can try to say, like, okay, we're going to have an on-call person that answers these questions. We're going to make them file JIRAs. We're going to have a Google form. Okay, that can work kind of, but the root problem is, like, people have questions that they need answers to. Maybe instead of doing all that, build a tool so they can answer their own questions. And again, now you've upgraded your problem from being like, we don't have enough bodies to respond to these questions, to now we're just maintaining a software system that can provide answers. And that's a much better problem to have than just purely like a, we're answering questions all day problem.
That's you just reminded me of something kind of personal, but related to Leanpub. So there was a few years ago, Peter and I decided, oh, we need to, we'll put someone else on top of what we call hello. So there's hello at leanpub.com is our main
See.
customer support thing. Let's put someone on hello. And we started realizing we were losing touch with what people's problems or needs were. Um, and then so the solution was I'm gonna like that I came up with was like, I'm gonna jump on the grenade. I'm gonna be, the one who literally reads every email and answers every email. But every email that we get, we're gonna treat like a problem that has a solution. And there's gonna be a public page they can go to in our help center for a solution to that problem. And the funny thing was, it was a way of, yeah, I never quite have thought of it in those terms before, but that was a way of the way of defending our time was to spend our time solving people's problems for everybody. Um, not just the kind of individual interaction, but like see it, okay, like how can we send that meant like I'm gonna jump on the grenade to answer the email, but like that means I'm gonna have developer time. That means I'm gonna have strategic time and for discussions and things like that for higher level things. Um,
That's
but
a great way to think about it. Like, I've worked at some places where you're trying to build like, the issue with documentation is it gets out of date so quickly. And like, okay, we wanna create like a run book or an FAQ. Do we just
Mhm.
take everything we know and spend 2 weeks writing that? But a better way to do it is, I think, what you described, which is every time you get a question that you think is like a broad question, just put that in the doc.
Yeah.
And you do that for a couple weeks before you know you got like 15 questions there. And now you've got something that's like that's much more of an investment. That's like investing your time versus just spending it.
Yeah, exactly, exactly. That was our hope, and it appeared to work out. But one of the things too is that like I mean, like speaking for myself, I have this kind of completionist kind of syndrome, I guess, where like I
Right.
really need if someone has a problem, I really need it to be solved. But
Right.
some people are problems. Um,
Right.
you can't solve that. It's not that they have a problem; they are a problem, and you just can't solve it. And sort of part of defending your time is just like letting it go. Sometimes you really need to just kind of accept that this is something that can't be solved.
Yeah, I mean, I think that plays into, I think, the first lesson in chapter 3, accept operational chaos into your heart. It's very much
Mhm.
that. It's like there's this desire of like, and look, there are some engineers I've seen where they can't accept that this graph looks weird. And
Yeah.
it's hard. Like our nature is like, why does that look weird? Why did that latency spike happen? We want to fix it. We want to understand it. But again, there's only so much time in the day. You have to, it's like a really, it's like an inflection point, if that's the word. You have to decide, like, do I need to understand every single detail about everything? Or can I just accept there's some things in the universe I will never understand? That, especially like things like traffic, there's all types of internet stuff that happens, or they call it internet weather. Latency
Mm,
goes up, no one knows why.
mm.
So you just have to accept that chaos into your heart and say, I can't solve everything. I can't understand everything. I need to move on with my day. And I think that's a journey that I think every engineer goes on at some point.
Speaking about that, so you're obviously sort of sharing in this book. You're sharing, your journey. And I love the title, "Push to Prod or Die Trying," which speaks to the kind of like incentives and feelings that actually people can have behind doing things. Um, are you planning on publishing? I believe you're planning on publishing more chapters in the future.
Yeah, yeah. Yep.
So
I've got
what are
3
one of
out.
those two of those chapters going to be about?
Yeah, so I've got, I think, there's 3 chapters that are done, and I'm debating whether there's gonna be 7 or 8 chapters, total. So you asked, like, what are the additional chapters gonna be about?
Yeah.
So chapter 4 is, what I'm working on now. That's inspired by, when Netflix went multi-region with Western Hemisphere traffic. So chapter 1 was, like, we inspired by when we went into Europe, and then chapter 4 was we took all of our, like, US and Latin America traffic and split it into between US East 1 and US West 2 and Amazon.
Mm,
The motivation for that, it's like a long story that I'll summarize. There was a huge load balancer outage at Amazon in 2012, and so Netflix went on this journey of, should we write our own load balancers? And ultimately decided no. But then we built this thing called an Isthmus, which I believe is on the Netflix tech blog, where we just took our edge, like our edge proxy, and put that in US West and routed all of that traffic back to our US East backend services. And then but then eventually we moved everything into West. And so that was an exercise of like, so Europe was unique because that was all new customers. This was existing customers splitting their traffic across 2 regions, which was really fascinating to watch. Chapter 5, just to go through it more quickly, is about me trying to work on it's inspired by me trying to work on a non-blocking Zool, which was our edge proxy that we built in chapter 2, and really just failing at that project and what I learned from that failure. Then also this other project that I worked on that was probably the worst project I've ever worked on in my career, and just dealing with that pain and suffering and how I came out of that. Chapter 6, I think is gonna be a shorter one, which is, about me deciding to switch teams. I switched from the edge team to the personalization infrastructure team, and also, like, the last thing I worked on the edge team, which was I wrote this code to, basically, it was like a switch we could flip to make Netflix go global. It's kind of when Netflix went global in 2016. So there was like a
Mm.
bunch of work behind that, and I wrote maybe 10 lines of code to for my part. But it's one of those things where I only wrote 10 lines, but if I didn't write these 10 lines, Netflix couldn't go global. So it's kind of an interesting way, like a small thing can have such a big change. And chapter 7, which is probably going to be the last chapter, is about me working on personalization infrastructure stuff at Netflix. Again, joining a brand new team. I knew nothing about it. So learning what this space meant, like getting up to speed in a couple of the projects I worked on, and maybe how to deal with a management chain that you don't get along with as well as the one on my previous team. How to navigate that.
Yeah, well, that sounds really awesome. That leads me to ask actually one of the last things I like to talk about on these interviews when the guest is a Leanpub author is what's your approach to writing? So you've got a Substack. I know you're pretty active on LinkedIn and stuff like that. Do you have a time of day like from 4 to 5 I write on weekdays and I take weekends off, or do you have a schedule? Do you wake up at 4 in the morning to write?
I definitely don't wake up at 4 in the morning. I'm not really a morning person. So I think I wish I had a more formal schedule. I think I write around or I schedule around like when my brain can do the best work. And so for me, it's usually morning, but not super early morning, maybe like between say 9, 10 a.m. and maybe like 2 p.m. is where I do most of my writing. Again, it depends on what else I have going on that day. But I think it's important to distinguish here between because I'm also I edit the book myself for better or for worse. So there is a difference between like writing and editing and making diagrams or things like that. So I find like I can only do like creative, thoughtful writing during those times that I mentioned, but I can sometimes edit at night. Now, there's different types of editing too. You can look at a paragraph and say this paragraph just isn't good enough. That's not that hard to do, but the harder thing is getting specific about what parts aren't good and how to make them better. Like to me, that's probably the hardest thing in writing is how do I take something that's not good, but I think there is something good there and turn it into something that's better. Like that just takes so much brain power. And like diagrams and stuff I can do at night too. So generally speaking, like I'm more of a early in the day type of person. I wish I wrote every day. Unfortunately, I don't, but I'm trying to get to that point, at least for the first quarter of the end through the end of this year and the first quarter of next year.
The last question I always like to ask is if there was one magical feature we could build for you on our platform, or if there's one thing that when you're using it, you're just shaking your fist at us going, damn you, Leanpub, why does this suck so bad? Can you fix this?
Yeah.
Can you think of anything that you would ask us to build or fix for you?
Yeah, there's one thing, and this might because I'm not yet a paying customer. Look, my sales have been up since that pragmatic engineer article, so I might switch that. But when I want to get my sales data, I have to click on a button on the website, and then it sends me an email, and then I click on a link in an email, and then I can download it. And so that process is a little clunky to me. Now, again, some of the other platforms I use, I still have to click and download, but that like, look, 3 steps versus 2 steps is not bad if you only do it once, but if you're doing it like multiple times a week, it's not great. I wish also I don't know if you offer like some type of Google Analytics integration with the paid accounts. But I know for me, like a lot of the work I do is trying to correlate like website traffic and newsletter traffic and sales. And so um I have to kind of do it the data's coming from different places and I have to like kind of do a soft correlation that is a little bit
I see.
inefficient. So I think if there was some way to streamline that. Other than that, I mean, I think the site's great and I definitely like enjoy selling my book on the site.
Okay, thanks very much for that. There is a sales page for every book. You go to the overview page, then click on sales, and it shows you a chart, and you can pick like I think it's like last month, last 3 months, or
Right.
lifetime, and that
Right.
shows you a chart and a couple of numbers.
I see.
Um, yeah, what you're saying is like making it easier because we do have. It's actually kind of funny, like uh, we actually have much more detailed kind of stuff than even Amazon KDP offers authors when it comes to the downloads, but
I see.
it is tricky to get to them, as you're saying, and then interpreting the sort of downloads and stuff like that. But we provide, details that go back to like I think you can actually like trace back from like a coupon link to a
I see.
particular purchase if you download the CSV with all the details.
Yeah, yeah,
You
yeah.
you can actually see when the payout date is gonna be for a particular sale and stuff like that. But it is hard to find, and it's just like a kinda, "Click here to download this CSV," which isn't the best kind of interaction, so we'll think about
Right.
improving that. And, oh, Google Analytics. So, yes, paid accounts can have Google Analytics.
Okay.
We do have Google Analytics integration. It's been a long time. They upgraded to GA4, like, I don't know, like, a couple years ago or something like that, but we were updated at that time.
I see.
Um, uh, one thing, Google Analytics is like, I mean, as you probably know, like, notoriously complex and changing all,
Oh, yeah.
and it is really bad. It's funny, we don't like to shit talk kind of products, but, like, it's
It's
weird, like,
terrible.
it's so important, but it's just so bad.
I wrote a script to pull down the data and make my own graphs. I cannot navigate that website anymore. I don't know if it's just something that I'm missing. I have to, because sometimes I want to see, like, what's my conversion rate? What's my website traffic? What's my sales on these dates? And I can't do that reliably through Google Analytics.
Well, but I gotta say that's gratifying to hear because I've tried to make, like, help center articles and stuff like that, like, in the past about, like, how do I set up my funnel and stuff like that, and it's just like, is it me or is it them? And it's like, actually,
It's them.
it's kinda them. Um, uh,
Yeah.
but, one thing I would say about that is that it is actually very cool, though, to know, like, is traffic coming from this blog post?
Right.
Is it coming from my blog? Is it coming from my Substack? Is it coming from LinkedIn? Stuff like that. That can actually be really helpful,
Right.
when you're thinking about book marketing and, like, how is what I'm doing over here helping what I'm doing over there,
Exactly.
stuff like that. So Google, and that's one of the reasons it's paid is, like, you have to have a paid account to get Google Analytics. Google Analytics support is, like, because it requires support and
Right.
backs and forth and stuff like that. But yeah, no, thanks very much for bringing that up. Well, Matt, thank you very much for taking the time out of your day to talk to me and to all of us about your really great book, Push to Prod or Die Trying, which is going to have some. It already has some great chapters, but it's going to have some more great chapters coming in the future that I'm going to really look forward to reading and sharing with people.
Yeah. Thanks for having me. It's good to be here.